Well, welcome back, everybody. We are ready to begin our next panel discussion. Thanks so much, everyone. It is so hard to get quiet after talking. Dean David Birdsell from Baruch College School of Public Affairs will moderate this next panel. The name of this next panel discussion is Defining and Measuring Impact, Insights from the Field. I also invite our panel to come up to the table. See, I'm reading my script. Just seeing if you're all paying attention. Seeing if I'm paying attention. David's bio is in your kits, but just to hit on a few highlights. He has centered his academic work on the nexus of communication, media, and information technology in politics, government, and nonprofit administration. Among many other roles, David is chairman of VCG Governance Matters and an advisory board member at Human Services Council, which are both event supporters for today's event. Joining David are Gordon Berlin, president of MDRC, a leading demonstration and evaluation organization, Elizabeth Gaines, executive director of the Osborne Association, a nonprofit that's currently participating in an interesting impact assessment program, and Dr. Carson Hicks, Director of Programs and Evaluation for New York City Center for Economic Opportunity. Details, again, are in your packet, and I'm going to leave it to David and the panelists to expand on their experiences and how it all feeds into the topic for today. Again, questions? Write them on your index cards, and BBB will walk around and collect them. There you go.
Thank you, Claire. Good morning again, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I introduce the panelists to my left. Actually, they've already been introduced, so I won't do that again. I want to describe them collectively, however. We have a great well of expertise here on the dais to address a set of issues that I think are among the most frightening for many people in the nonprofit world. How do I assess what I'm doing? What is it that I'm trying to measure? How much do I have to know in the way of statistics to make it happen? And please don't make me compute the strength of the power of the observations that I'm trying to make. I think myself that we too often get these questions wrong. Either by not making our analyses rigorous enough or by creating a kind of assessment frame that is essentially impossible to fulfill. We heard on the last panel essentially an implicit lament about the amount of time that all of our organizations have to spend adducing our impact in some respects. I don't think there's anything more important that we can do beyond the nature of the service itself, and we can't make the service itself meaningful unless we do it. But we want to do it smart. We want to do it efficiently. We want to do it to get the best information that we can. And I will stipulate in advance that the people to my left are the people who do it right and have been among the leaders in thinking about how we effectively evaluate what public and nonprofit organizations do. Everybody is going to speak for about 7 minutes at the opening to give a brief overview of what they would like most to share with you, and then we will dive into particulars. I have every confidence that this is going to be a very lively discussion. We're going to start with Gordon Berlin of MDRC.
Thank you very much, David. It's really a privilege to be here, and I know many of you, and we've had the privilege to work with many of you. So I want to sort of cover, while I'm here today, 4 topics. I'm just going to mention them, then I'm going to sketch out 2 of them, and hopefully we can get to the others in the discussion. The first is just what's driving this thing we call the evidence-based movement. And part of the answer is the Federal Office of Management and Budget, and I'm happy to say more about that. The second is to help you understand what the difference is between outcomes and impacts. Outcomes are the things you measure day to day and the performance indicators in your program, and net impacts are something entirely different. The third thing that I'm going to spend the most of my time on is helping you understand the challenges that an evaluator faces in trying to measure net impact. And the final thing that I'll try to cover either here or in the questions, once you've heard me and agree that you really need to get a reliable measure of what difference your program is making, what are the 4 things you need to do to maximize the likelihood that you'll make a difference? So let me jump right to this outcome impact distinction. I've already indicated what an outcome is. If you're running a job placement program, it's the % of people you place. And then if you're doing follow-up on them, it's the % of people who are still in a job 90 days later. What's a net impact? An impact answers the question, what difference did you make above and beyond what might have happened to the people in your program if you didn't exist? Let me talk to you a little bit about what the evaluation challenge is in trying to get that measure. So there are basically 3 things, and this goes to the heart of the question of, is this really a difference? Or, I mean, a distinction, or is it a distinction without a difference? There are 3 challenges that an evaluator would face if you came to me and asked MDRC to evaluate your program. The first is maturation bias. So think about a program you run for an after-school program for elementary school kids. Kids at that age are growing and developing, they're maturing, hormones are kicking in and out, their brains are evolving. At the beginning of being 9 years old, you're really different by the end of being 9 years old, if you're a kid. So let's say that you were running a program that was designed to improve academic outcomes for that young person, or a program that was designed to work with them on their social emotional development. If I look at you that young person at the beginning of the 9th grade and the end of the 9th grade, of being 9 years old, I might conclude that I'd made a really important difference. That's an outcome. But in fact, a lot of those things would have happened anyway, right? If you'd introduced a new program for that person. Take a criminal justice program for juvenile offenders offering cognitive behavioral therapy. The most important thing we know about juvenile delinquency is that most of these kids age out of that. So the first challenge then is, how much of what happened is because of you, and how much is because of maturation? What really would have happened over time in the regular course of that young person's development? Second challenge, history. Let's go back to the job training example. What do you think your placement numbers would look like in the roaring 90s? The strongest economy, 4% unemployment? And now ask yourself, what will they look like if we were to measure your outcomes and do a study in the depths of the Great Recession? That's history. How much of any change that we might have seen in your numbers, how do we think about how your program's really performing when the percent of people who you might be able to place in any of those 2 given time periods would look radically different, I think. That's really this history or environment kind of a problem. A program may be keeping things from getting much worse, even though your actual placement and outcome numbers they might look worse than they did previously. That's the history problem. So now, how do I determine how much of what I see is due to maturation in history, and how much is the result of the program? To answer that question, an evaluator needs a counterfactual. We need some kind of comparison, and the standard thing we do is we go out and we look for a group of people that look on characteristics just like the people that you serve. So if I'm running a program for juvenile offenders, and I want to know whether it made a difference, I report on, or former offenders, I report on their recidivism rate, let's say. And I then compare that to what this longitudinal data says about the recidivism rates typically for kids in this age group and in that problem, in that period of time. The problem with those kinds of comparisons is that almost all the programs run by the people in this room are voluntary. Now just think about that. By definition, they're different. They stepped forward and came into your program. So they're different on the things you can't measure, motivation. Now add to that the fact that your program may well have a front door with a screen. How many of you give tape tests? How many of you have people at the front door who do recruitment who look for that gleam in the eye? The young person who really wants it, the person you're convinced you can really make a difference for. And that's where we confront the third problem in being an evaluator. And that problem is called selection bias. The biggest challenge that we have in designing this thing and getting an answer to maturation in history is figuring out how do we identify a control group, a comparison group, a counterfactual that would tell us reliably, controlling not just for the demographic things you can match on, but the things you can't measure, whether or not you're really making a difference for this group of people. Now, take the job training example just one more time. It's not all just what you do at the front door. It's what the WIA job training system demands that you do at the front door. They're only paying for success. And your people have realized they can get their program numbers, their outcome measures up. How? By spending a lot more time thinking about who you're admitting in the front door. Let me just go back and give another example. Take a GED program. So I have program A. Program A is getting 80% of the people in it a GED within 3 months, 6 months, let's say 6 months. Program B is getting 30% a GED in 6 months. Which is a better program? On your outcome measures, it's, you think, what kind of evaluator is that? It's pretty straightforward. Now, what if I told you that program A only took 10th grade readers and program B only took 4th grade readers as measured by the tape? Which program is doing a better job? And that's why we really need reliable net impact studies to understand what the return on investment is, what the value added is. Let me just briefly mention the final point, and then I'll end. So of course I've left you with the great mystery. How do you solve that problem? Well, it turns out that there is a very simple, very elegant solution. One that all of us can understand, and that almost always produces, if done properly, the right answer, a reliable answer to this net impact question. And that's a random assignment research design. Now, a lot of people will say, that's the gold standard. These are the Olympics just ended. I'd be happy as hell with a bronze. The problem is that when you use these alternative methods, they can work sometimes, and I'm happy to give a fun example involving Oprah later in the conversation. But they often get you the wrong answer. And why? Because it ends up being an argument about all kinds of very heavy statistical lifting that I can't understand and you can't understand, and the methodologists will spend ages arguing about it. When what we want to argue over is, what do we make of the actual finding? Random assignment is easy to understand. You have a group of people, you flip a coin, you create two equal groups, you compare their averages a year later, 6 months later, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, and if there's a difference, the only thing that could explain that difference, because everything else is held constant, right? Because the two groups experience everything else in history, in maturation, in the environment, in the same way. That gives you this reliable answer. So you're arguing over the answer. The last point, which I'll elaborate on more later when we're in the discussion. So having heard that and realizing that given the pressures of the evidence-based movement, what is it you have to do if you decide to be part of an evaluation like this? You need to do 4 things. The first question is what you do. The first answer to that question, right? Is it really fitting the problem? Is it a good fit? Is it really the right initiative? The second is how well you do it, the quality with which you're implementing it, engagement, how you do recruitment, what you're really imparting, the talent of your staff. Those are all measures of really that quality question. The third problem should be self-evident by now. Who you serve. If you serve the wrong people, you can have a great program. It can be the best program you've ever seen, really well implemented, But if all those kids would have gotten A's on their SATs anyway, you haven't made a difference. You haven't made a net difference. And the last factor is context, basically. The context in which your program operates. If you're in an environment in which it's a very service-rich environment, and I'm doing a random assignment study and all the control group goes down the street and gets into a program that looks just like yours, is the same quality, is designed the same way, I don't have what we call in the business a treatment difference. And if there's no treatment difference, I'm not going to find a program difference. I don't really have the right design to answer your net impact question in that example. Thank you.
A very strong case for rigor. We are going to, just a footnote though, those abstruse statistical studies, that's a full employment program for graduates of programs like ours, so it's an independent benefit. But what I would like to do now is jump to Carson, who's going to talk about this from the perspective largely of in-house evaluation. Carson.
Good morning, everyone. So before I kind of dive in, I want to give you a little background about my office and what we do. We were established in the mayor's office in 2006 to pilot and evaluate anti-poverty initiatives. So basically, we partner with different city agencies. They in turn hold the contracts with nonprofits like yourselves in the community. We have piloted over 60 programs. We've conducted about 50 evaluations. About 500,000 people have been served by CEO programs, and we have worked with hundreds of nonprofits. I'm telling you this just to give you a little bit of context. We're funded with an innovation fund that is public and private dollars, and it pays both for the programs as well as for the evaluation activities. So evaluation was central from the very, very beginning, and Gordon has made an excellent case for rigor and for net impacts. We do a bunch of things on the evaluation front. Obviously, the bigger goal is to establish net impact, but there are some steps along the way that we engage in to kind of understand how programs are actually serving individuals, what experiences they themselves feel they're getting out of programs, what staff feel is working well with a program or not. This is not intended to get at the impact question, but to understand what the sort of experiences of participants. We also partner with independent evaluation firms like MDRC that do much of the work. This is in part so it's not the City of New York saying something works or doesn't, but rather there is an independent firm that is providing the evidence. In addition, we engage in a lot of monitoring. Evaluation can be expensive depending on what you're doing. And we like to do a lot of monitoring, particularly when a program is first getting up and running, to kind of ensure that it's being implemented in the way that we intended, and producing outcomes, whatever those may be, that is the byproduct of the program. So, we are capturing things like how many kids are we serving, for an example, or how many jobs, the outcomes that Gordon was making reference to. So those things, along with other criteria, are 3 other criteria, in fact, how we decide when and what exactly we're going to evaluate. So one question is, when do you expect these certain outcomes? A job placement program might have outcomes that you could anticipate within, a few months, as opposed to somebody earning an associate's degree, which could take several years, if not considerably longer. We also look at, has this program model been evaluated? Is there evidence that this has worked elsewhere? What does the research have to say about something? And then what is our level of investment? If for an example, we have a food handler certification in New York City, any place that is preparing food has to have somebody who has a food handler certification on staff. This is something that we do for inmates on Rikers. It's, like a 12-hour program, and it's a $23,000 investment on our part entirely. We're not going to do a random assignment on this because that would be way too costly and wouldn't make sense. So we take into consideration all of those things, and then, sort of decide what we're going to evaluate. So I've already talked a little bit about this more qualitative stuff around focus groups, for an example, interviews, that we often do early on for programmatic improvement reasons. We just, want to see, are we actually doing the things that we want to be doing with this program? Is it being implemented with quality, et cetera? We also will do outcome analysis, mostly because we want to see, are there characteristics of individuals that are seemingly related to some of the positive outcomes. Now, this is not a story of causality. I come in with a GED, ergo I'm actually, getting the job placement, but rather if people are coming in on balance, if they have higher educational levels, are they more likely to get job placement? So we do that type. And then, of course, we do the impact analysis that Gordon was talking about, both the more simple version of the random assignment evaluation, the treatment and the control, and then the annoyingly, statistical comparison group that, both of those are ways that you sort of get at net impacts. And then we also do cost-benefit types of analysis, which I think is ultimately really important when you want to look at your return on investment and whether or not you are actually getting a bang for your buck. And then we take these results and we use them to inform program design, to come up with better models. And we also use them for just discussions, like this one here, about what's working and what's not working, and make all of these results publicly available. I've been working at CEO since 2007, which was really just after we started. And one of the things that I think has been so fascinating over the years is how the story, or how the conversation rather, about evaluation has changed. When we first started, you really had to make the case for investing money in evaluation. And it seemed to be this kind of equation of either you put it into programs or you put it into evaluation. And so if you were putting it into evaluation, you were taking it away from programs. I don't think that's true. And what has evolved over the years is people really recognizing that evaluation is tremendously useful, not only on the net impacts front and really telling you if what you are doing is in fact working, but also in terms of improving programs and understanding participant experiences and all of that. And I think it's now, it's really part of many funding streams. The current lexicon is building the evidence, but a lot of funders, both public and private, really insist that there is some type of evaluation that takes place so that, they have some measure to know whether or not it's worth investing in a particular program or not. So I just think it's really interesting to observe how that has changed over the years. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, President. One of Gordon's examples was on juvenile justice and justice-related issues are where Liz spends her life. So, Liz.
Oh, thank you. So the Osborne Association works in all aspects of the justice system, but the issue that Gordon raised was a particular program that we're doing at Rikers Island. Just to put it in the context of impact, and I am old enough to remember when impact was only a noun. And I'm also been at Osborne 30 years, so I am no longer intimidated by researchers, but that doesn't mean I really understand or agree with a lot of things, and I think that's true for a lot of us. One of the things we saw last week, I think it was last week, was after at least 3 perfectly decent studies have shown that people in prison who get higher education have a recidivism rate that is shockingly lower than anybody else. And then the governor announces that he's going to put some money into college education. It led to a complete shitstorm over how dare they provide college to these horrible people. And so in that, many of us have sort of lived through times when the evidence just didn't matter. People don't listen to that. And when you see sort of Lakoff and a lot of the framing people, you realize that a lot of times responding to sort of the other side. I have a house in North Carolina, and it was snowing down there, and everybody just accepted as truth that this meant that there was no global warming. And responding to them with how many scientific studies there are proving that just doesn't go anywhere. So as much as I think it's very important, it's also important for us in the field to define measures and success in our own way at the same time that we have to pay very careful attention to what the research is telling us. I think where the evidence-based movement has not been so helpful is in the area of innovation, which is that now virtually all of our funding tells us to select a intervention from a list of evidence-based proven models. And that's not necessarily a bad thing unless you're trying to resolve an issue or deal with a problem in which there hasn't been a lot of evidence, and we want to do new things. So I think it's very important to remember that in terms of shifting systems, in our case from retribution to reconciliation, that there are moral arguments and that there are ways that we still have to be able to make a case and use the research, which we'll always find something to support us, because remember, and then the other thing I love about research is that always have the same last line, which is more research is needed. All of which is true, but what we're really enjoying, though, is this experiment that we're doing with our funder, MDRC, on Rikers Island, which was the first in the country of a private investor, in this case Goldman Sachs, putting up money for us to do an intervention that is completely evidence-based. MDRC, thank God, was the one who selected the model. If they'd left it to me, it would have been hippie go free. But they selected an evidence-based model that makes a lot of sense. And it's a cognitive behavioral intervention. It is not voluntary. The goal is to serve every child on Rikers Island, which is 16 to 18-year-olds. This is a population that in any other state besides New York and North Carolina would be juveniles. So they're kids, and we're working with them, and the impact or the outcome, excuse me, I feel like he's going to shoot me and we're going to lose the contract. The outcome is reducing recidivism by 10 to 20%, right? In which case, hey, we just go in there and serve the kids. He is responsible for figuring out how we're going to count the impact. But what's really interesting is that, and they have a very high recidivism rate, and cognitive behavioral therapy, I happen to be a big believer in it. I do Weight Watchers, it's the same thing. When my kids needed interventions, that's what was recommended for my children. I think kids on Rikers Island should get what middle-class people get. So I'm very happy to do that. The truth is that what motivated us more than anything else to want to do this program was to reduce the violence in this jail on Rikers Island. Because for our staff, that matters a lot. Seeing these kids subjected to the kinds of trauma that jail has for them. So it's not going to be the outcome that's being measured, but it's connected in some way, and that's the other thing we have to think about is what are these outcomes and what do they mean? In our world, unfortunately, the only outcome people ever seem to care about is recidivism, which is a proxy for some good things in life, but not for everything. So we're very excited about the work. We do believe we've changed the environment at Rikers. The Corrections Department thinks that violence has gone down, at least in part, because of this. And we won't know for a while, and I'm sure as in questions, Gordon is better prepared to answer how this research is going. The thing that, in terms of Carson, that was concerning to us was that in a jail program, I think that measuring impact as quickly as we had to ramp up, I think turned out to be a little early for the amount of, for the control, I'm going to get this wrong. To start the experiment. And I think we've learned a lot of things along the way. I'm just hoping that researchers who are good at writing, we need more research. If this doesn't turn out quite the way we're hoping that it does, we'll be able to make the same case that more is needed, because I think we've made a big difference for folks. And I think what's important for nonprofit leaders is knowing that we're making a difference. And what the challenge for us is understanding how research and evidence can actually help us do that.
we have a lot of issues on the table, and this is absolutely fascinating. Let me bracket one big set of issues that Liz raised in the context of North Carolinians denying climate science. This is not an attack, by and large, on North Carolinians, Tar Heels out there in the audience, but I do want to look back before the end to that question, sort of the status of research in popular culture and the extent to which anybody on the panel or in the audience thinks that that actually creates headwinds for us if we try to understand the relationship between research and action differently. But I'd like to come back to two issues. One is to this whole question of random assignment as the kind of gold standard here, and how that term inflects your attitudes toward that kind of research. But I want to begin, actually, Liz, with what exactly was happening between you and Gordon here. That Gordon's starting an experiment, you just want to serve people in prison. Talk to me about how you resolve that conversation from each of your perspectives, if you will. Obviously, Liz, you buy into the value of research and shaping your programs and making them as influential as you possibly can. But talk a little bit about that dynamic, because we're seeing it on display right here.
Well, first of all, I do read all the research, and I'm fascinated by it, and it does guide us all the time. Why I can do something like this is that we understand the importance of implementing a model with fidelity, and we have a lot of integrity about that. So regardless of whether I would have done it a different way or whether I think it would have been really nice to do a different kind of incentive, when we proposed to do this and when they selected us, it was based on an assumption that we would, to the best of our ability, manage the program according to the plan that we agreed upon. And I have no problem with that at all, because they provided us with certified instructors to make sure that all of our staff were trained to deliver the model with fidelity. We were able to bring in a quality assurance person, and they were also to make sure that we were doing what we said we were going to do, because we believe that if we couldn't demonstrate that a program on Rikers Island can make a difference, that even though it may not influence the public to think differently about these kids, we believe it will affect the city of New York's willingness to think about these kids, because our goal is, if we can show that this program works, that at the end of this experiment, if it does, that the city will continue to fund this program. And unfortunately, this has to be a program in which the outcomes can be monetized, meaning the reason the city would buy into this would be that we could serve enough kids with enough impact, enough outcomes, that the size of the population would go down. And it would go down enough to close a housing unit, not just one or two kids less, enough to close enough space on Rikers Island that a monetized theory says you'll save, I don't know, $14 million, and that they're agreeing that some of that money will then be used to continue the program. So the ends in this case were much more important than my kidding Gordon about research and stuff. And I'd be interested in his view of that.
As would I. Gordon, in many respects, you have a perfect collaborator in Osborne and Liz. But I can't imagine that all of these conversations go as smoothly. I mean, can you talk a little bit both about this case, but also about how you respond to executive directors and others who may be skeptical and really want to be able to, at the end of the day, to make the political argument? I need to be able to adduce data that will sustain my programs, which is not necessarily the same thing as saying I need the best, most independent assessment of the impact of my programs.
So just let me start at the last point, because I think Liz really captured the heart of what we're trying to do on Rikers and the reason that we're trying to do it. The first thing is, if one of you were to come to me and say, we really need to do a rigorous study of our program, the chances are good we would spend a lot of time with you and conclude together that we shouldn't, that you're really not ready yet for a variety of different reasons. So we often say no. The second big question, and we could talk more about why that would be, but essentially we did a review, we looked at engagement, we looked at recruitment, we spent a lot of time inside your program, and we think there's a lot of things you should do to strengthen it before we go to the expense of doing something more rigorous, and we're we're often saying no. But when you come, the first thing, let's say we decided to go forward, the first thing we want to know is, what are your goals? It's not up to me to say, this is what we'll measure you on. It's really got to be that you're saying, these are the things that really matter. In the Rikers case, the city came to MDRC and said, we have this idea, we've been playing around with it for over 18 months, we have been unable to get it to happen, can you make it happen? We are not the evaluator. We simply agreed to spend a lot of time inside Rikers, try to understand what would work better. The city had picked a model that would not have worked well in terms of CBT. They'd already agreed on CBT. And by the way, the first thing I said when I saw this was, you know, if you really want to save money on Rikers, you could just make bail for these kids. They're all sitting there in jail for months. It's costing a fortune. And basically, they're sitting there because nobody's able to make bail for them. But that wasn't on the table, you know, by the city. But I still hold out hopes that I can convince somebody to try that. So the long and the short of the goals really depend on you. And the last point is this, and it's really the most important. The biggest danger in all of this evidence-based stuff is that it gets taken as an up or down vote, right? It worked, we'll do it. It didn't work, it won't. I'm almost always going to find that it's not working nearly as well as it could or should. And the question is whether I can design an evaluation that will help you strengthen your program. If you want to be a high-performance manager, it isn't just managing outcomes. You're doing an evaluation not because you're trying to check a box, oh, I got one of those, move on. You're doing it because in your heart, you come to work every day because you actually want to make a net difference. You want to make value added. And I can help you do that. I'm going to teach you things together. I'm going to learn things with you that we had no idea were going on. So I'll give you just one parting example here. We did this evaluation of CEO, and we found that they had very positive effects on recidivism, and that led to a major expansion in their program under one of these evidence-based federal things called the Social Innovation Fund out there. Well, early on, one of the little things that we discovered, CEO was designed to serve recently released ex-offenders. More than half of the sample, I think it's half or 40% of the sample, turned out to have been out for a long time, well over a year. And they were showing up at CEO because the parole officer loved these guys and they just lost their job and CEO had a job to offer them right away. But that's not where the sweet spot was supposed to be. It's not who the program was designed to serve. And lo and behold, the evaluation demonstrated that it was having almost no impact on that group when we did subgroup analysis. All of the eventual impact was being driven by the kids who had just, or by the young people, the ex-offenders who had just come out. So I'll stop there. Just, we're not the evaluator of Rikers. We helped to design it. The city really said, I mean, this is a little unfair, but my characterization of Rikers, having spent time there, it's kind of a desert island in terms of programming. Liz and others have braved that and gotten in there for some things. Here was a chance to get the government to do something it wouldn't do. It doesn't have the resources to do. If we can demonstrate that in fact it reduces this, one of every 2 kids on Rikers come back in 1 year. One of every 2, 16 to 18-year-olds are back there in a year. If we could cut that down, the city would save enough money to give you taxpayers something back and to do more programming in that jail. And that's the value added of a rigorous study of using, you know, quasi-experimental methods.
I've got a whole bunch of cards with your questions in front of me. Let me just let you know that most of them fall into a couple of categories around the cost of random assignment, experimental designs, and various ways of getting that funded. So in this next question, which I'm going to start with Carson, but I'd like the other 2 panelists to respond as well if you think that you have something to say about this. 2 questions about random assignment. Carson, you said that you didn't always choose that design, in part for cost reasons, in part for programmatic imperatives. And one of the people in the room, actually 3 of the people in the room, are concerned about random assignment because it by definition involves denying a kind of service to some people in the context of the experimental design, which is very common in drug trials, for example. Can you talk a little bit about the ethical issues, if you perceive those to be important in your decision-making calculus, and when you do and do not choose to use random assignment models?
Yes, and then I'm going to ask Gordon to weigh in on this too, because I think he has the argument for this. But I do understand that many folks do feel that this is a denial of services. I think first and foremost, in our case and in many cases, when a random assignment evaluation is being conducted, it is because there are in fact more people than slots, and substantially more people than slots. So not everybody would actually be able to get into this program in the first place. So it is not actually a denial of services. And when you look at what you are in fact trying to achieve, basically understanding whether or not Program X is in fact responsible for massive changes, impact, et cetera, it is often worth the investment. We, as I mentioned, don't do this often, in part because of the cost, and in part because there's not always a sufficient number of people who would be going into a particular program, and therefore it just would not necessarily make sense to do a random assignment. So while I'm sensitive to the fact that some people do feel it's a denial of services, I really do think it's important to understand the circumstances under which most random assignments will take place, and it is not, in fact, denying people services.
So I would just add that the second question that I ask you if you came to me for an evaluation after I ask you what your goals are is, do you have a waiting list? Or if you went out and recruited more aggressively, are there people you can't serve because you don't have enough slots? If the answer to that question is no, then random assignment is not ethical under any circumstance. Almost all the time, you're going to tell me that you do have more people that you could serve. And if you could make the case that your program worked better, you could get more resources and you could go out and serve more people. With regard, I'd just like to point out, right now, if it's true that you can't serve everybody, how do you decide who to serve? And tell me what you think is fair. That gleam in the eye, first come, first serve, your counselor choosing based on how they think that interview went, or a lottery? And then on the cost of random assignment. Random assignment is not what's expensive. What's expensive is a longitudinal study. That is, if we have to follow young people or old people over a long period of time. That money doesn't go to the evaluator, it goes to the survey firm. You know what it costs to go out and interview people in one of our studies? $1,000 to $1,500 per survey completed. Take a sample of 5,000 or 6,000, 3,000 program group members, 3,000 control group members, interview them at 18 months, interview them at 36 months, interview them at 54 months, that's $10 million easily.
Does institutional size, measured at least in a couple of ways, I mean, one, the annual revenue that an organization is able to command, and particularly the SLAC revenue that can be invested in this kind of service, is that one of the big variables that we should be looking at, that funders should be looking at when they're thinking about the quality of the product? Or is it more a matter of numbers served or not served? This notion of a waiting list, for example. Everybody in health policy went completely over the moon a few years ago when Oregon extended its Medicaid program, but not able to cover all of the people who qualified for the extension. And so all of them said, bingo, you have random assignment design, and it's just happening there for public policy on a massive scale. What are the scale questions that you look at?
Well, I just want to say one thing about Medicaid, which you just mentioned, which is that it's about to change the business model for every health and human services agency in New York City, and probably the state, and maybe the planet. But and this issue on how we are going to be measured and have to price and think about outcomes at large and small scale is just going to be extraordinary. So, I mean, we were not successful in getting MDRC to just come and evaluate everything we did, which I would have loved. We tend to get our evaluations done when we are a site in a multi-state something that the federal government funds, and they do the evaluation. So I'm actually not probably able to answer that. But we should really figure out how the Medicaid thing one of these days is going to kill us or help us all.
a question again. I think it's the having enough numbers, not the institutional size per se. And then you seldom have the money to do this yourself, almost never. The question is whether you have a group of funders who together with you decide we can learn enough to make what you do stronger. This is an investment we want to make together. Because it's a big investment in your time also.
I agree. I don't think the size of the institution matters a lot. I think there's good programming that can take place everywhere, and absolutely the numbers. One of the things I would put out there, you know, there's a lot of great universities, academic researchers, and others that, you know, could potentially collaborate to do evaluation work, and you know, graduate students as well. And I think when people are trying to figure out the cost of doing particular types of evaluation, resources, et cetera, that is an avenue I would, you know, encourage people to explore, because I think it is a way potentially to do some of this work, you know, slightly less expensively. And, you know, honestly, a lot of academics have grants and other things that they could potentially put towards this type of research.
Funded academics, very important decision, but we'll get into that later. Just picking up on that point, a number of questions have come to the table about collaboration. And collaboration in two respects. One, collaboration among funders to make it possible to do more of this kind of work. And another about how collaboration can confound the assessment of the impact of an individual programmatic component. And the person who asked this question is referring to some of the ideas coming out of the last panel about putting organizations together to make them work more effectively toward goals, but then complicating the effort to try to figure out which component of that collaboration produced a result.
Well, a natural experiment that we did starting 25 years ago was the organizations that work in a field called Alternatives to Incarceration and Reentry. And we made a decision, and maybe it's just because we were all little organizations. I mean, when I started Osborne, there were 2 people. And my colleagues were also much smaller, Fortune cases, these organizations. And we made a decision, spurred by alcohol in a hot tub, but still, it was an important decision, that we needed to grow the funding instead of fighting over a tiny amount of funding. And we have, in those 25 years, grown the pool and the impact, in my view, of our work exponentially by we hire a lobbyist together. We go to Albany together, and if I can't go, I absolutely know that my colleagues will be able to actually push the interests of Osborne. They know exactly what we each do. What we do in the private sector would be arrested for antitrust probably, but we talk through making sure we're not all doing the same things. We choose not to compete in certain areas, and we choose to. So I think that when it's a strategic decision to grow a field and interest in a field, and it's, I mean, New York has gone, from when we started, our prison system was 70,000, it's down to 54. We've closed prisons. The governor gave us one of those prisons to turn into a community reentry center, and we're doing this with our colleagues. So I think there's just a huge benefit to it, but not when it's imposed, because every time we've had funders try to get us to do it, it's like, really, them?
So Liz has never invited me to join her in her hot tub. You know, there are a lot of questions that aren't about net impact. And collaboration is probably one of them, without knowing all the details of the specific example. And I think it's just really important to be clear about what question it is you're really trying to answer. And, you know, there are a tremendous amount of things that we can learn that help strengthen what we do, that have nothing to do with measuring what net difference you make above and beyond. Something collaboration often might fit in that category. Did it work better? Do I have more referrals? Are they getting more of my people? I would be, you know, happy knowing that I broadened the range of services I'm able to make sure the people I'm serving get into.
I have 2 final questions that, again, aggregate some questions. I know I have many, many more questions here than I can actually present to the panel, so I'm trying to combine as much as possible. A number of people want to know what small organizations that don't have the resources or the client bases or whatever it is to do random assignment experiments can do to show the impact of their programs. suggestions?
Well, the two suggestions that I give is for almost all of you, the feasibility of being, doing your own randomized controlled trial is pretty small. I mean, you could decide you're only interested in one or two outcome measures and use administrative records like recidivism, which I think Liz has legitimately and validly complained about being too narrow. But you can do that, and it's a lot cheaper because you're not spending all that money for a survey. So that's one way to think about getting this work done. I think what you want to do is ask, what am I doing that looks like what other people are doing who participated in some of these rigorous studies? And am I using evidence-based practices to the maximum extent that I can? So that's one way to take advantage of what's out there. We're New Yorkers, and we always think that there's no other way to do it but the way that we're doing it. But I've learned to be humble about that. We have a lot to learn from other people and other activities out there. And being in the camp of people who've had rigorous studies done of CBT and learning from their experience, if you're going to run a CBT program, maybe picking one of those models, emphasizing fidelity to the model. Those are some of the ways to think about how to take advantage of it. And the second is to use Liz's example, which is to be part of a larger study when you get the opportunity. That's a nice thing to do because you get a lot of attention, you're integrated in all that, and if it doesn't work, you can blame it on all the other studies.
Carson?
I think the only thing actually I'd add to what Gordon had to say is, hire the right person on your staff who can do some of this work, using, for an example, the administrative data or other data that may be available to you. I think it's important, if you don't really have the resources, that is one area you could invest in, and just make sure that the person, has the capacity to do that type of thing.
Last question. There are a number of people who want to know how to measure things that are harder to measure, and the examples here are art, leadership development, civic engagement, holistic programs. Are these hard to measure? And if so, what approaches do you recommend taking?
Yeah, they are hard to measure. I mean, bottom line, they are hard to measure. With things like that, that is where we will often do survey work or focus groups. Again, we're not, from the get-go, we're not trying to say this art program is causing this result, but what we are trying to understand is what people are experiencing in that, in that art program that they may feel is beneficial, so that we could at least have something to say about it. But yeah, hard to measure.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a shout out to Community Resource Exchange because they have been really good at helping us figure out how to measure or how to think about measuring the advocacy aspect of our work and our community engagement and how putting this institution in the South Bronx may or may not be affecting those kinds of things. I mean, it's different when it's just serving a certain number of people and doing the outcomes. Those kind of things, there are people that are they've just been so helpful to us to be able to figure out how to think about those things.
And if the people who ask those questions would like to stop by and talk to me on the side a little later, there is some good stuff happening in civic engagement, and I'd be happy to point you towards some of the better research in that arena. But right now, what I would like to do is to thank our panel for a terrific conversation. Please join me in doing so. And at the risk of glossing, we know that rigor really matters. We know that you do have people who are willing to help you think through that. We do know that there are alternatives to the most costly designs, but you should try to figure out how to use them when you can, and everything goes better with alcohol in a hot tub. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, panelists. Another fantastic program session. Thank you so much.